Okay, class. So last time we talked about comparative advantage and how specializing in what you have a lower opportunity cost or comparative advantage is beneficial and you end up with more. Then we started the topic of market and how market consists of supply, which is based on sellers and cost, and it's based on demand, which is based on consumers or buyers. And together they make a market and set a price of a product. So then we said that initially it was thought that price was only set by how much the product costed to make, but that's not true. That demand also matters in deciding the price of the product. So we said that law of demand is an inverse slope, that as price increases, quantity demand decreases, meaning as a product becomes more expensive, less people buy it, and vice versa. And if a product becomes cheap, more people buy it. Other things constant. And we highlighted the other things constant part because later on today we will see how other things don't remain constant always, and it affects the entire demand curve. Entire demand curve can shift inward or outward depending on the circumstance. A point to keep in mind is that quantity demand are specific points on the demand curve, and demand refers to the entire curve. So anytime in questions it says quantity demand, it's talking about specific points on the curve, and anytime on exams or quizzes it says demand curve increases, you know that the entire demand curve is shifting outward or increasing. So that's an important point to keep in mind. So what are some things that can shift the demand curve? There are, if you notice that so I have an example here, hold on. According to the law of demand, when price increases, demand decreases, right? But what about playoff games? Like if it's a Pirates game in Pittsburgh, they're so expensive, but the demand is also high. So what's going on here? Why isn't the law of demand not being followed? Well, that's because other things are not constant in this circumstance. Why? Because people value it more. The preference to watch the Pirates game is extremely high. So other things are not constant. So what are some things that can shift the demand curve? When things are not constant, the demand curve can actually be shifted. So today we're going to talk about things that are not constant, that can actually shift the entire demand curve. We know that changes in price can increase or decrease quantity demand. So any change in prices can increase or decrease the demand curve, increase or decrease the quantity demand, quantity demand. Other things constant. So we know that this is your initial demand curve, this is your initial price. let's say that price decreases to P1. This is your new price. So initially quantity demand was at this point, this many people were buying it. Q0 was the amount of people buying the product. When price went down, Q1, quantity 1 is the amount of people buying the product. So increased quantity increased this way. Remember, this is 0, this is the x-axis, this is the y-axis, this is 0, and quantity is increasing this way. So any changes in price can change quantity demand, specific points on the demand curve. What happens when there is a change in price, all right, but other things are not constant? Then the demand curve can either shift outward, demand can increase, or demand can decrease. The entire demand curve can increase or decrease. So today we're going to talk about what are the factors that can actually increase or decrease demand, the entire curve. So let's begin. Shifters of demand. Entire curve. So we're not talking about specific points on the demand curve, but we're talking about the entire curve. What are the factors that can shift the entire curve? A change in taste and preference. A change in taste and preference can shift the entire demand curve. For example, when something new and cool comes out, people are willing to pay more for it, and demand is high. So like when the new iPhone comes out or something like that, it's so expensive, but yet people are paying so much money for it, you know. So that's one of the shifters of demand, a change in taste and preference. People prefer to buy these new gadgets, these new cool technology. Another example would be something out of fashion. Something out of fashion is selling for $1, but nobody buys it because it's out of fashion. So according to the law of demand, cheap product, more people should buy it, right? But here nobody's buying it. Why? Because it's out of fashion. So it comes under taste and preference, that people don't prefer it anymore. So what would happen? Actually the demand of that cheap cloth for $1, so that was the initial demand, but now it's out of fashion. Initially it was $5, now it became $1, out of fashion now. Demand will actually shift downwards and decrease. That for every quantity sold, less people are buying it now that the demand has decreased. Okay, so number two. Second thing that can change or shift the demand curve. And we'll do more examples after I'm done with listing all the things that shift it. And we can do more examples with numbers, etc. So, number two, changes in income. Changes in income. Changes in income can shift the entire demand curve. If people's income increase, demand increases for normal goods. Demand increases for normal goods. What are normal goods? We'll talk about it. 1 second. If people's income increases, their demand increases for normal goods and decreases for inferior good. So what are normal goods and what are inferior goods? Normal goods are, I don't know, expensive stuff, things that people with high salary would prefer. So a nice car like Lexus maybe, or house in a good neighborhood. Expensive wine. Branded clothes. What are some examples of inferior goods? Well, cheap beer. What else? Second-hand used cars. You know, smaller apartments or ramen noodle, cheap food. Ramen noodle because it's cheap and it fills you up, you know, in just $1. So these are inferior goods. Normal goods would be, you know, dining at a nice restaurant or buying grocery from a nice place. That would be all normal goods. So when a person's income increases, their demand for normal good increases. They want to buy more normal goods, and their demand for inferior good decreases. And the opposite is true. When a person's income decreases, they buy more inferior goods. So their demand for inferior goods would increase. So when income increases, demand for normal good increases. Demand for normal good increases. When income decreases, demand for normal good decreases. Here, when income increases, demand for inferior good decreases. when income decreases, demand for inferior good increases. When you're making less money, you buy more inferior products. Make sense? Questions in the discussion thread. Okay. Number 3. Number 3 is prices and availability of other products. Prices and availability of other products can shift the demand curve. So number 3, prices and availability of other products can shift demand curve. So this one is a little bit tricky, and I really need you to pay attention. What it's saying is that prices and availability of other products can shift the demand curve of a product. So, okay, let me explain you. 1 second. Let me write this down and then I'll explain you. So there are substitutes and complements here.